The morning Caroline Whitaker arrived in Coulter's Creek, Wyoming, she had $14, a single carpetbag, and a dead husband's name she had no particular reason to keep. The year was 1879, and the territory was the kind of place where a woman alone either found her footing fast or disappeared into the dust like she had never been. Caroline was 24 years old, brown-eyed and possessed of a stubbornness that had gotten her into trouble more often than it had saved her, though she privately believed the tally was about even. She had come west from Missouri on a stagecoach that smelled of pipe tobacco and unwashed wool, seated between a land surveyor who spoke too much and a preacher who spoke not at all, and she had watched the landscape change from soft green hills to something harder and more honest, and she had felt, without entirely understanding why, that the hardness suited her. She had been married to a man named Gerald Whitaker for 2 years before a fever took him outside of Kansas City in the spring of 1878. He had been kind enough, Gerald, in the way that some men are kind the way furniture is comfortable, reliably present, and never particularly remarkable. She had grieved him properly, worn black for the months she could afford the dye, and then she had packed what remained of their shared life into a single bag and decided that going forward meant going west. Coulter's Creek was not what the land agent's pamphlet had promised, though Caroline supposed nothing ever was. The pamphlet had described it as a thriving community positioned for growth, which she now understood to mean there was a general store, a saloon, a church whose roof leaked on the eastern side, and a muddy main street that turned to something resembling soup every time it rained. The population sat at just under 300 souls, most of them cattle ranchers or men in service to cattle ranchers, and the women were scarce enough that Caroline felt the town's collective eyes on her the moment she stepped down from the coach. She asked at the general store whether there was work and lodging to be found, and the storekeeper, a round-faced man named Elias Potts, told her she could board with the widow Maren Sundstrom at the east end of town for $2 a week, and that the hotel needed a woman who could keep books and manage the front desk, since the previous woman had left to marry a cattle baron in Colorado and taken her organizational abilities with her. Caroline took both offers and spent the first 3 weeks learning the rhythms of the town. She was quick with numbers, quicker with people, and the hotel owner, a jolly man named Mr. Hector Burns, raised her pay after her second week because she had resolved a dispute between 2 trappers over a room that had been double booked, and she had done it without raised voices, and with both men feeling they had gotten the better end of the arrangement. She was not unhappy. She had not expected to be happy. Exactly, happiness felt like something that belonged to people whose circumstances had more room in them. But she was busy, and busy was close enough. It was in her 6th week in Coulter's Creek that she first saw Clarence Keene. He came into the hotel on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and the first thing Caroline noticed was that he was wet from the rain, and that he did not seem to care even slightly. He stood in the doorway for a moment, water dripping from the brim of a dark hat, scanning the room with gray eyes that moved the way a careful man's eyes move, measuring, sorting, settling. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had done physical work his entire life, rather than the way of a man who had set out to be broad-shouldered, and his face was weathered and angular, with a jaw that looked like it had opinions. She guessed him to be somewhere around 30. He walked to the desk and set a hand on the counter, and up close she could see that he had a small scar along the left side of his jaw, and that his eyes were not simply gray but a particular shade of gray that reminded her of winter sky right before snow. "I'm looking for a room," he said. His voice was low and even with a slight drag to it that she could not quite place, somewhere south, she thought, or maybe just west of south. "How many nights?" she asked. He considered. 2, maybe 3. $2 a night. He nodded, reached into his coat and produced exact change. She wrote his name in the register, Clarence Keene, and thought it a precise sort of name, clean and unadorned, the kind of name that did not require anything extra. "You are new here," he said. It was not a question. "6 weeks," she said. "Longer than me then." He picked up his key. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," she said, and the title still felt odd in her mouth without the man attached to it. He nodded once more and went upstairs, and that was all. It was entirely unremarkable, and yet she found herself aware of him in the way you are aware of a sound you cannot quite identify, not alarmed, just attentive. He stayed 3 nights, as it turned out, and he came and went quietly and caused no trouble, which alone made him notable among the hotel's guests. On the morning of his second day, he ate breakfast in the small dining room off the lobby, and Caroline, who sometimes helped with the morning service when the girl who usually did it was slow to arrive, brought him coffee and biscuits, and they exchanged perhaps 20 words, most of them practical. On the morning of his third day, as he was settling his account, he said, without particular ceremony, "There is a cattle drive running through the valley next week, and they will need help managing the waypoints. I know the terrain. I'm thinking of hiring myself out as a scout and trail guide. If this work holds, I may be in and out of Coulter's Creek for the winter season." Caroline was not sure why he was telling her this, but she said, "Then we will put you down as a regular account." Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and she thought it might have been the beginning of a smile. "That would be efficient," he said. He came back 2 weeks later, and then again after that. By December he had stayed at the hotel 6 times, and each time he stayed the conversations at the front desk grew a little longer and a little less transactional. She learned that he was from Texas originally, that he had served as a ranch hand from the age of 16, that he had spent a stretch of time working as a deputy in a small town in New Mexico that no longer existed after a fire took out half its buildings, and that he had come north because he had heard there was land to be worked, and he was tired of working other men's land. She told him about Missouri, about Gerald briefly, without elaborating on the grief because she did not want his pity, about the stagecoach and the preacher who did not speak, and the way the landscape had changed into something harder and more honest. He listened the way some people listen, not waiting for a space to insert himself, but actually absorbing what she said. One evening in December, the temperature outside having dropped so sharply that even the inside of the hotel felt thin and insufficient, she was closing up the ledger at the front desk when he came down from his room with his coat still on and a piece of paper in his hand. He set the paper on the counter. "I found land," he said. She looked at the paper. It was a survey map, crudely drawn but legible, showing a parcel of land several miles northeast of town, butte up against a tree line and with a creek running along the southern edge. "That is good land if the survey is right," she said, because she had learned enough from listening to ranchers to know what made land valuable and what made it merely decorative. "The survey is right. I walked it myself." He leaned forward slightly. "There is a cabin on it. Previous owner built it and then left when his wife refused to come west. It is rough." "How rough?" "It has walls," he said, "and a roof that covers most of it." She almost laughed. "That is a modest description." "I am a modest man." She looked at the map again. "What will you do with it? Build on it? Ranch on it eventually? It needs a season of serious work before it is what I want it to be." He paused. "I was wondering if you knew of anyone who needed temporary lodging. I am offering the cabin rent-free in exchange for someone keeping it in order while I am working the trail circuits. It would be temporary. A season, maybe 2. Caroline looked up from the map. She understood very suddenly that he was not asking about someone in general. He was asking about her specifically, and doing it in the most indirect way possible, which told her something about him, that he was careful, and that he did not want to be refused, and that he had been working up to this for some time. She thought about the $2 a week she paid Maren Sundstrom for a room that was cold and small and smelled of the old woman's liniment. She thought about the fact that she had been saving carefully and that $2 a week represented a significant portion of what she earned. She thought about the survey map with the creek along the southern edge. "How far is it from town?" she asked. 4 miles, a manageable ride. "I do not own a horse." "I have a spare," he said. And then, as if he had only just realized the scale of what he was suggesting, he added quickly, "It would be entirely proper. I am on the trail most of the time. You would have the place mostly to yourself." She studied him for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching, and she decided that whatever he was not dishonest. "I will see it first," she said. "Of course." She saw it on a Saturday, riding out on the spare horse he lent her, which turned out to be a steady-tempered bay mare named Ruth. The cabin sat in a small clearing at the edge of the pines, and it was, as he had said, rough. The walls were solid pine logs chinked with dried mud that had begun to crack in places. The roof was intact except for a section above what would have been a back room, which had been covered with boards and oilcloth in an improvised repair that had done its job without being elegant about it. There was a stone fireplace along the north wall, a plank floor, two small windows with wooden shutters, and a lean-to addition on the east side where a person could keep a horse. It was not comfortable, but it had the quality of a thing that could become comfortable, and Caroline Whitaker had never in her life been offered something that was already finished. "It needs caulking along the north wall," she said, "and that back section needs proper roofing before the deep winter." "I know," he said. "I can do the caulking myself if you get me the materials." He looked at her with a slight narrowing of those winter sky eyes. "Can you?" "My father built houses," she said. "I was the third child and the most useful one." He almost smiled again. She was beginning to recognize the shape of it, the way the right corner of his mouth lifted a fraction before he caught it. "Then we have a deal, Mrs. Whitaker, if you want it." She wanted it. She moved into the cabin on the 1st of January, 1880, with her carpet bag and a second bag she had accumulated over the preceding months, and she set about making the place habitable with the methodical determination that had carried her through everything else. She recaulked the north wall with a mixture of clay and pine pitch that held better than the original. She hung curtains she had sewn herself from fabric bought at Elias Potts's store. She organized the small kitchen area, such as it was, and she negotiated with a rancher's wife who lived 2 miles to the west for the use of an iron stove that the woman's family had replaced with a larger one. Clarence was away more than he was present in those first months, as he had said he would be. He was scouting for cattle drives heading north, working as a hired hand on the long pushes through the valley, occasionally serving as a guide for the survey teams that were still mapping portions of the territory. When he came back to the cabin every 2 or 3 weeks, he brought supplies, always more than she needed, as if he was worried she would run short in his absence. The first time he came back and saw what she had done to the place, he stood in the doorway for a long moment. "You hung curtains," he said. "I did. And the stove, I got it from the Hendersons. They did not want it any more." He walked slowly around the single main room, taking it in with that measuring look she had come to know. The curtains were blue and white check. She had stacked the firewood according to a system: dry wood nearest the fireplace, green wood further back to season. She had laid a braided rug she had made from strips of old fabric over the coldest section of the plank floor. It looked nothing like it had looked when he had first shown it to her. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said at last. "Yes, you have made this a home." She said nothing for a moment because the word landed with a small weight. "It is still temporary," she said, because that had been the arrangement and she did not want him to think she was overreaching. "Of course," he said, but he said it in a way that did not entirely sound like he meant it. He stayed 3 days that visit, and they fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly uncontrived. He was up before dawn and out working the land when the weather allowed, splitting wood and clearing brush, and beginning the slow work of fencing a portion of the property. She made breakfast early and kept it warm for whenever he came in. They ate supper together in the evenings at the small table she had pushed against the window so they could see the last of the light over the tree line, and they talked about everything: the territory, the cattle business, what she had heard at the hotel during her shifts, what he had seen on the trail. The conversations were easy in the way that conversations are only easy when both people are genuinely interested in what the other has to say. She was still working her shifts at the hotel in town. The arrangement suited everyone. She rode Ruth into town 3 days a week and kept the account books and managed the front desk. And the rest of the time she worked at the cabin and slowly began to tend the small plot of ground on the south side of the building that she thought might take a kitchen garden once the ground softened. She told herself it was temporary. The spring came with the violence that Wyoming springs sometimes have 2 feet of snow in March, followed by a thaw so fast the creek overran its banks, and she spent a long afternoon stacking sandbags with the help of a neighboring rancher named Old Pete Bauer, who was 70 years old and still worked like a man of 40, and told her she had chosen a fine piece of land. "Mr. Keene chose it," she said. "And you are keeping it," Pete said, and left it at that. Clarence came back in mid-April to find the sandbags still stacked along the creek bank, and the cabin entirely unharmed by the flooding. He examined the bags, looked at the water line on the trees, and looked at her. "You did this yourself." Pete Bauer helped. Pete Bauer is 70 years old. "He is also very strong and very sensible about water management," she said. He shook his head slowly, and this time he did not catch the smile fast enough. Spring settled in and the days lengthened and grew warm, and the kitchen garden she had started proved more ambitious than she had initially planned. She put in beans and squash and potatoes, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence because she liked them and saw no reason to be purely practical about everything. Clarence watched the garden the way a person watches something they did not expect and are not sure what to make of. "You are putting down roots," he said one evening in May, sitting on the front steps watching her water the beans from the creek. "Plants need roots," she said. "That is just botany." "I was speaking metaphorically." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I know you were." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but weighted. There was something between them that had been building since January, with the patient accumulation of small things, shared meals, shared labor, the particular intimacy of 2 people navigating the same small space. She was aware of it. She suspected he was aware of it too. Neither of them had spoken about it directly, and she was not sure whether that was caution or wisdom or simply cowardice dressed up as patience. What she knew was that she had stopped thinking of the cabin as temporary sometime in March, and she had not decided to stop. It had simply happened, the way some shifts happen without announcement. In June, Clarence came back from a 3-week scouting circuit, and he was quiet in a way she had not seen before. He ate supper with minimal conversation and sat on the front steps afterward looking out at the tree line as the fireflies began to appear in the grass. She sat down beside him after a while. "What happened?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I rode through a settlement on the eastern edge of the territory," he said. Settlers had come in the fall, tried to establish on land that the Arapaho had used seasonally for generations. There was a confrontation. He paused. Nobody came out well from it. She waited. The settlers lost 2 men, and the Arapaho lost their winter food stores to a fire that I do not believe was accidental on either side. His voice was measured, but she could hear something beneath it, not anger exactly, but a weariness that went deeper than tired. "I have been riding through this territory for 2 years, and the pattern is always the same. The government draws a line, the line moves. Nobody who drew it is anywhere near the people it moves for." "No," she said quietly. "I do not know what a man does about that," he said. "I am not a policy man. I cannot change what Washington decides, but I can see it clearly." "Seeing it clearly is not nothing," she said. "A lot of men riding through choose not to." He looked at her sidelong. "Your opinion of most men is not high." "My opinion of most men is accurate," she said. "Which sometimes looks the same." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. The tension in his shoulders eased fractionally. After a while he said, "Thank you for keeping this place." "You pay me in room and board," she said lightly. "No," he said. "I mean it. I ride out knowing the cabin is standing and the garden is growing and the wood is stacked in it." He stopped. "It matters is all." She did not say anything, but she stayed beside him on the steps until the fireflies were too many to count, and neither of them moved to go inside. The following week, Caroline was riding Ruth back from her shift at the hotel when she came across a young woman sitting in the ditch beside the road, crying with the quiet determination of someone who had been crying for a long time and had no intention of stopping yet. She was perhaps 19, dark-haired, wearing a traveling dress that had been through considerable difficulty. Caroline stopped the horse. "Are you hurt?" The woman looked up. Her name, it turned out, was Nora Fitch, and she had come from Ohio to marry a man named Douglas Pratt who ranched 20 miles west of Coulter's Creek. She had arrived on the stage that morning and found, upon reaching the Pratt Ranch, that Douglas Pratt had married someone else 6 weeks earlier and had apparently neglected to write and say so. "He corresponded with me for 8 months, Nora said. 8 months of letters. He said he was ready to have a proper wife and build a proper life. And instead he built one without you," Caroline said. Nora pressed her handkerchief to her eyes. "I have no money to go home. I spent nearly everything on the passage." Caroline considered. Then she said, "Come with me." She brought Nora to the cabin and gave her the back room, which by that point had a real roof thanks to Clarence's work in the spring, and she wrote a letter to her contact at the hotel in town about whether there was additional work to be found. Within a week, Nora was helping with the hotel laundry, which was not glamorous but was steady, and she had a room in Maren Sundstrom's boarding house and a plan that extended at least to autumn. When Clarence came back and found Nora in residence, he accepted it with the equanimity of a man who had learned that Caroline Whitaker's decisions were generally sound even when they were not strictly expected. He simply moved his spare gear to the lean-to and asked if Nora needed anything. Nora looked at him with the wide eyes of someone who had not dealt much with men of quiet competence and said, "No, thank you, Mr. Keene. Caroline has thought of everything." "She usually does," he said, and caught Caroline's eye, and this time he did not suppress the smile at all. Nora moved into town by August, once she had saved enough for a proper start. On her last evening at the cabin, she sat at the table with Caroline while the sun went down and said, very directly, "You know he is in love with you." Caroline set down her tea. "You have been here 2 months." "I have eyes," Nora said. "He has not said anything. He does not need to say it. It is visible in the way a man carries himself when he is somewhere he considers home." Nora folded her hands on the table. "And I believe you know that." Caroline was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Clarence splitting wood in the fading light, the steady, rhythmic sound of the axe that she had fallen asleep to a dozen times already, that she had incorporated into the texture of this life so completely she no longer consciously registered it until it stopped. "He said the arrangement was temporary," she said. "Do you believe that?" Another silence. The axe continued its rhythm outside. "No," Caroline said at last. "I do not believe it." "I do not believe either of us believed it for very long." "Then perhaps," Nora said gently, "it is time to say so." Nora left the following morning and the cabin was suddenly very quiet, and Caroline found that the quiet sharpened everything. She noticed more acutely the way Clarence's hat hung on the peg beside her coat, the way his coffee cup was always on the left side of the shelf because that was where she had first put it and neither of them had ever moved it. The small domestic machinery of 2 people who fit together. She did not say anything that day, or the day after. He seemed to notice something had shifted. He was careful with her in a way he had not been careful before, not distant, but attentive, as if he was listening for something she had not yet said. On the 3rd evening after Nora's departure, they were washing up after supper, working in the comfortable wordless coordination they had developed over months, and he handed her a plate to dry, and their fingers overlapped on the edge of it, and neither of them let go. They stood like that for a moment, the plate between them, the lamp throwing its warm light across the kitchen table, and the curtains she had made and the garden visible through the window in the last of the summer dusk. "Caroline," he said. And that was all he said, but her first name in his voice was its own complete sentence. She looked up at him. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I want you to know that I have thought about it for a considerable length of time and I am not saying it lightly." "All right," she said. "I do not want this to be temporary." His voice was steady, but she could hear the effort of the steadiness. "I have not wanted it to be temporary since February, I think. Maybe January, I am not certain of the exact moment." Her heart was doing something complicated and warm. "February," she said. "What?" "It was February for me, too. There was a night you came back from the trail and it was sleeting and you ate supper and then fixed the loose board on the front step even though it was 9 o'clock at night and sleeting, and I thought." She stopped. "What did you think?" She set the plate down on the counter. "I thought, I do not want to stop seeing this, watching you, knowing your habits. I thought it quietly and then told myself very firmly that it was temporary and I should not let myself become attached." "Did it work?" he asked. "No," she said, "it did not work at all." He let out a breath that sounded like relief, and he set his own towel down and he took her hand properly, not accidentally, and held it between both of his. "I am not good at this," he said, "at saying things this way. I am better at showing things." "You have been showing things," she said. "I have seen." "Then you know." "Yes," she said, "I know." The kiss, when it came, was not desperate or sudden but slow and deliberate, the way he did most things, with intention, with full attention. His hands were on either side of her face, his thumbs along her jaw, and she had her hands on the front of his shirt, and the whole world outside the cabin could have been anything at all. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers and they stood like that in the lamplight for a while, and she thought that if a person could locate the exact coordinates of a moment they wanted to keep, this would be that moment, this exact configuration of warmth and silence and beginning. The second winter at the cabin was different from the first. The first had been about survival, about caulked walls and stacked wood and maintaining the practical facts of the arrangement. The second was about something else entirely. It was about two people learning the terrain of each other with the same careful attention they had learned the terrain of the land. He courted her properly, or as properly as the situation permitted, given that they were already sharing a cabin. He brought her wildflowers in October, which he presented with a slight awkwardness that was more endearing than any smooth gesture would have been. He read to her in the evenings from the novels she borrowed from the minister's wife, who had an impressive small library, and he read with feeling and without self-consciousness. He learned that she hated to be cold, and made sure the fire was always built before she came in from outside. She learned that he had a habit of not sleeping when something was on his mind, and she learned to recognize the particular quality of the silence at 3 in the morning that meant he was sitting up with his thoughts, and she would make tea and sit with him, and sometimes they would talk, and sometimes they would not, and both were sufficient. He proposed in November, 2 weeks before the first heavy snow, standing in the garden where the sunflowers had gone to seed, and the stalks were bent and dry and rattled in the cold wind. He had clearly thought carefully about what he wanted to say and then lost it when the moment arrived, because he stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and said, "Caroline, I would like, that is, I hope you would consider, what I mean to say is." "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I have not asked yet." "You are going to ask me to marry you," she said. "I was, yes. And my answer is yes." He stood there another moment, processing this, and then he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the best sound she had heard in a considerable time, and he put his arms around her and lifted her briefly off the ground, which was not a thing she had expected from a man of his generally reserved nature, and she was laughing too, into the collar of his coat. They were married in the Coulter's Creek Church on a Saturday in December, with Pete Bauer serving as witness and Nora Fitch, who had come back from town dressed in her best and crying already before the ceremony began, standing beside Caroline. The minister was a young man named Reverend Aldous Cole, who had a tendency toward long sermons, but kept this one brief, perhaps sensing that the two people in front of him had already done most of the necessary work. The reception was held at the hotel dining room, courtesy of Hector Burns, who, it turned out, had developed a fatherly affection for Caroline over the preceding year, and covered the cost of the dinner himself, and looked inexplicably proud of something he had had nothing to do with. That night, riding back to the cabin together in the dark with the snow beginning to fall in soft curtains and the horses moving steadily through it, Clarence said, "I told you it was temporary." "You did," she agreed. "I was wrong." "Thoroughly," she said. "Are you bothered by that?" She thought about the peg where his hat hung beside her coat, the coffee cup on the left side of the shelf, the sound of the axe in the evening, the way he built the fire before she came in from the cold, the way the cabin looked nothing like a rough structure with a patched roof anymore but looked, simply and completely, like home. "Not in the slightest," she said. "The third winter was the hard one." Wyoming winters had a way of reminding you that beauty and danger were not opposites, but sometimes the same thing. And the winter of 1881 to 1882 came in with a blizzard in November that lasted 4 days and buried the linta to the roofline. Clarence and Caroline spent the first 2 days digging out paths to the water pump and the wood supply, working in shifts because the wind was too severe for comfort outside, and they kept the fire burning through the night, and the temperature inside the cabin stayed tolerable if you wore an extra layer. There was a third person in the cabin now, though she was very small and took up surprisingly little space for someone who had so thoroughly reorganized the priorities of 2 people. Margaret Rose Keene had arrived in October, their first child, 7 pounds and loudly opinionated from the first moment, with her father's eyes and her mother's determined mouth. Caroline had insisted on having old Dr. Crane from town in attendance rather than managing alone, and Clarence had ridden to town in the rain to fetch him and been back within the hour, which Dr. Crane later told anyone who would listen was the fastest he had ever been conveyed anywhere. Clarence had held Margaret the first time with the same focused attention he gave to everything he cared about, looking at her with an expression so unguarded it had made Caroline's eyes sting. "She is so small," he said. "She will not stay small," Caroline said from where she was lying down, bone-tired and triumphant. "No," he said, and the word carried in it some comprehension of time, of passage, of everything a small thing becomes. "No, she will not." The blizzard that winter was the kind of event that a community defines itself by. Coulter's Creek came together with the pragmatic generosity of frontier people who understood that your neighbor's survival was related to your own, and by the third day, a chain of riders was moving between properties with news and supplies, and old Pete Bauer, who had survived enough Wyoming winters to have lost count, sent one of his ranch hands over with an extra sled load of firewood and a note that said simply, "First-time parent winter. Take the wood. Do not argue." Clarence found this extremely funny, which suggested to Caroline that the stress of the blizzard had affected him in ways he would not admit directly. By the time the snow cleared and the temperatures rose enough to make the world navigable again, Caroline had reorganized the entire cabin to better accommodate a baby in it, which required no small amount of creativity given the available space, and Clarence had begun drawing plans for an addition on the western side that would give them a proper second room. "This was always going to be small for the long term," he said, showing her the plans one evening while Margaret slept. "You said it was temporary," she said. "I have said things that turned out to be incorrect," he said, with perfect equanimity. "The addition went up in the spring of 1882. Clarence did most of the work himself, with Pete Bauer's 2 ranch hands helping on the weekends, and Caroline cooked for all of them and also helped lift and position beams when an extra set of hands was needed, because she was not a woman who stood at the side of things when the work was happening. The addition added 2 rooms, a proper bedroom separate from the main living area, and a room that was optimistically designated a nursery for now and, as Clarence said carefully, could serve other purposes later. "Other purposes," Caroline repeated. "As circumstances might warrant," he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has chosen his words deliberately. She looked at him. He looked back, Margaret, who was 6 months old and had recently discovered that banging a wooden spoon on the floor produced an entertaining sound, banged her spoon on the floor. Circumstances, Caroline said, and left it at that. She was still working her shifts at the hotel, 3 days a week, leaving Margaret in the care of a young woman named Della from town who had been looking for work and turned out to have a gift for babies. It was not an arrangement Caroline was entirely at peace with. She had not expected to feel so reluctant to leave her daughter, even for a day, but the income was practical, and the work kept her mind sharp, and she had long since learned that being useful in the world was part of what made her herself. Clarence's work had shifted by this point. He was doing less trail scouting and more of his own land development. He had fenced 12 acres and was running a small cattle operation, modest but growing, and he had established a working relationship with the Bower Ranch that involved shared equipment and occasional collaborative drives to the railhead at Cheyenne. He was building methodically the thing he had come north to build, and he was doing it with a seriousness and steadiness that made Caroline understand, watching him, that what she had recognized in him from the beginning was not simply competence but genuine character. There was a morning that autumn. Margaret was a year old and had recently achieved the ability to walk, which she performed with the lurching confidence of someone who believed strongly in the enterprise if not yet in its execution. When Caroline was in the kitchen making preserves and Clarence came in from the east pasture and set Margaret on his shoulders, which was his standard greeting method that Margaret received as her absolute right. And he carried her around the kitchen while she grabbed at his hair, and he accepted this without complaint, and Caroline watched them from the corner of her eye while she sealed the jars. She thought, "This is what I did not know I was coming west to find." She had come west for practical reasons, for economy and independence, and a clean break from a life that had run its course. She had not come west for this particular specific warmth, for this man with her daughter on his shoulders and the look of someone who had found the thing he was going to build his life around and intended to do it properly. But the West had offered it, and she had not been too proud to take it. The fourth winter arrived with a particular theatrical quality, an early frost in September that killed the last of the garden, followed by a warm October that gave everyone false hope, and then November coming in cold and clear and final. By the fourth winter, the cabin was no longer the rough structure with a patched roof that Caroline had first seen in January of 1880. It was a proper home, 2 additions, a real covered porch on the front that Clarence had built in the summer, a kitchen that had been expanded and properly outfitted, a garden that in warmer seasons produced abundantly, and a barn that was modest but functional with 6 head of cattle and 2 horses in addition to Ruth the mare. Caroline no longer worked at the hotel. She had stopped her shifts the previous spring, partly because Margaret needed her more and partly because the cattle operation had grown enough to require genuine management, bookkeeping, correspondence with buyers and suppliers, the logistics of running a working ranch, even a small one. And Caroline's head for numbers and organization proved as useful here as it had at the hotel desk. She had also, by the fourth winter, developed a reputation in the surrounding area as a woman of practical knowledge and steady judgment, which meant that other women in the valley sometimes came to her with questions that were not always about ranching. A woman who needed help writing a letter to a distant court about her land claim. A young wife who was frightened of her first pregnancy and needed someone calm to explain what to expect. A group of settlers 2 valleys over who needed someone to mediate a water rights dispute with a neighboring rancher before it became something worse. Clarence observed this accumulation of purpose around his wife with a kind of quiet pride that he expressed through action rather than declaration. He made sure she had time for these things. He arranged his own schedule around them when he could. He never once suggested that her attention might be better focused elsewhere. On a December evening of that fourth winter, Margaret was asleep in her room, and the snow was coming down outside in the thick, serious way that meant it would be a long night, and Clarence and Caroline were sitting by the fire. He was working on a piece of tack that needed mending, and she was reading, and it was so ordinary, so thoroughly unremarkable, that she set down her book and just looked at the room. The curtains she had made from blue and white check fabric were still there. She had replaced them with identical fabric twice over the years, because she had wanted to keep the same look. The coffee cup was still on the left side of the shelf. The fire was built exactly as he always built it, with the same arrangement of logs that produced a reliable, lasting heat. The braided rug had been replaced by a larger one she had made over the course of the previous winter while Margaret was sleeping. 4 winters. She had been here 4 winters, and neither of them had complained about it. Not once. Not even in the ways people sometimes complain about things they have chosen. Not with sighs. Not with a half-articulated wish for something different. They had simply built this life and inhabited it and kept building. Clarence looked up from the tack and found her looking at the room rather than her book. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That you told me it was temporary," she said. He set the tack mending down. "And here you still are." "And here I still am," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His thumb moved over her knuckles in the slow, absent way of someone performing a gesture so habitual it has moved below consciousness. "Any regrets?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The $14 and the carpet bag, the stage from Missouri, the storekeeper and the hotel desk. The first time she had seen his name in the register, Clarence Keene, clean and precise. The map with the creek along the southern edge. The curtains and the caulking and the garden, the fireflies in July. The night he had first said her name in that way that was its own complete sentence. The church in December with the snow coming down and Nora Fitch already crying. Margaret, 7 pounds and loudly opinionated from the first moment with her father's eyes. 4 winters, neither of them complaining. "No," she said, "none." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, and then held her hand in both of his. And outside the snow continued to fall, and the fire burned with its reliable, lasting heat, and the world was exactly the size it needed to be. But Caroline Whitaker was not a woman who stayed still for long, even in happiness, because happiness to her had never meant the absence of motion. It meant moving with purpose rather than from necessity, and there was still considerable motion ahead of them. In the spring of 1883, when the snow pulled back and the ground went soft and Ruth the mare dropped her first foal, a small, knock-kneed creature with considerable personality whom Margaret immediately named Butter, and the name stuck. Caroline told Clarence over breakfast that she had been thinking about the school. He looked up from his eggs. "What school?" "The one Coulter's Creek does not yet have," she said. "The minister's wife teaches the children twice a week in the church, but she has been doing it for 3 years and she is not a trained teacher, and there are now 14 children in the valley of school age, with more coming every year as families settle." He set down his fork. "You want to build a school. The community wants to build a school," she said. "I want to help make that happen." He considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "I need you to talk to Pete Bauer about donating timber," she said, "because he will listen to you, and I need to speak to 3 or 4 of the other ranching families about contributing labor, and I need Hector Burns to allow the use of the hotel dining room for the organizing meeting." "You have thought this through." "I think things through," she said. "You do," he agreed. He picked up his fork again. "I will talk to Pete." The Coulter's Creek schoolhouse was built in the summer of 1883, on a piece of land donated by the town. A solid single-room structure with proper windows and a real door, and a cast-iron stove that was donated by a rancher's wife who had replaced hers with a newer model and wanted to feel useful. Caroline organized the whole enterprise with the same methodical determination she brought to everything else. And when it was done, and a trained teacher named Miss Elspeth Ward had been hired away from a school in Laramie to run it, there was a small ceremony at which Reverend Aldous Cole gave a moderately brief speech, and Pete Bauer, who had donated the timber, and then spent every spare weekend helping build the walls. Took off his hat and looked at the building with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to know which things matter. He caught Caroline's eye across the crowd and nodded once, and she nodded back. Margaret started school the following spring at the age of 4, which Miss Ward said was a little young, but given that she could already recite the alphabet and count to 50, she allowed the exception. Margaret went every morning with a small dinner pail and came home every afternoon full of information she delivered to both parents simultaneously at the supper table. She was, as she had always been, loudly opinionated and fiercely smart, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's mouth, and she was a constant small miracle that both Clarence and Caroline found themselves looking at sometimes with the same expression. This mingled wonder and gratitude, and something that was not quite disbelief, but was adjacent to it. In the late summer of 1884, Caroline's second pregnancy announced itself with the quiet certainty of a body that has learned a particular vocabulary. She told Clarence on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly, while they were both working in the kitchen. He went very still for a moment in the way he went still when something important was happening and he was absorbing it. "When?" he asked. "February, I think. Dr. Crane will tell us better." He reached across and put his hand along her face, the way he had put his hands on either side of her face that first evening by the lamplight, and he looked at her with those winter sky eyes that she had now been looking into for 4 years. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Good," she said, and meant it. Their second child was born on a bright cold morning in late January, which Caroline considered February adjacent and was willing to accept as a successful prediction, and it was a boy. He came into the world in the same room where Margaret had come, with Dr. Crane in attendance and Clarence nearby, and he was 8 pounds, and had his mother's brown eyes and his father's jaw. And he did not cry as loudly as Margaret had, but looked around the room with a considering expression that made Dr. Crane say he had never seen a newborn look so thoughtful. They named him Samuel Peter Keene, Samuel being Clarence's father's name, and Peter being old Pete Bauer's given name, a tribute that made Pete remove his hat and press his lips together firmly for a moment when he heard it, which was the closest to emotional Caroline had ever seen him. The cabin, which had not been only a cabin for some time now, having grown into something that more accurately merited the word homestead, accommodated the new arrival with room to spare. The nursery room became Samuel's, and Margaret was relocated to what had been a general storage space that Clarence converted over 2 weekends into a small, proper child's room with a window that looked out on the sunflower garden, and a wooden shelf for the books and small figures that Margaret had accumulated. Margaret received Samuel with the cautious curiosity of a child who has had something thoroughly explained to her and is now evaluating whether reality matches the description. She sat beside him in the first afternoon and touched his hand with one finger and said very seriously to her father, "He is soft." "He is," Clarence agreed. "He will need to be taught things," she said. "He will." "I will help," she said, with the confidence of someone who regards teaching as a natural extension of authority. "I know you will," Clarence said, and met Caroline's eyes over their daughter's head, and the look that passed between them was the particular look of two people who are sharing something that does not require words. The cattle operation grew through 1884 and 1885. Clarence hired a ranch hand, a quiet young man named Tom Easley who came from Kansas and had the virtues of reliability and a good eye for cattle, and the virtue of not talking when he had nothing to say. Tom built himself a small bunkhouse on the edge of the property and became part of the rhythm of the place, eating supper with the family on Sundays and fitting into the life with the ease of someone who does not require much fitting. The territory was changing around them. Wyoming was moving toward statehood. Conversations about it were everywhere, in the saloon and the general store and the church and over supper tables. The railroad had changed what was possible and what was profitable. New families were arriving with a consistency that was reshaping the character of the valley, and Coulter's Creek, which had been a raw and uncertain place when Caroline had stepped off the stage with $14 and a carpetbag, was beginning to look like a town that intended to remain. On a summer evening in 1885, Caroline and Clarence sat on the covered porch they had built, watching the last of the light over the tree line. Samuel was asleep. Margaret was allegedly asleep, but almost certainly reading by the thin light from her window, which was a habit she had developed and which neither parent had the heart to strongly oppose. Ruth the mare and Butter the foal, now a grown horse, were moving peacefully in the south pasture. Tom Easley was at the bunkhouse. The cattle were where they were supposed to be. It was, by any measure, a life. "I want to ask you something," Clarence said. "Then ask," she said. "Are you content?" He asked it carefully, with the attention of a man who wants an honest answer and is prepared to receive one. Not just comfortable, content. Is this, he paused, is this the life you wanted? She thought about it carefully because he deserved care. "I wanted independence," she said. "I have it. I have it more completely than I ever imagined it because I built it with you, which is better than building it alone." She pulled her shawl a little tighter against the evening cool. "I wanted to be useful. I am useful. I wanted to be in a place that had room in it, room for me to be all the things I am, not just the parts that were convenient." She looked at him. "You have never asked me to be smaller than I am. Not once. Not in 5 years." He was quiet for a moment. "That would be a waste of considerable resources," he said. She laughed softly. "I am content," she said. "I am more than content. Are you?" He looked out at the pasture, at the homestead they had built from a rough cabin with a patched roof and a creek along the southern edge, at the addition and the barn and the schoolhouse in town and the hand he had hired and the 2 children sleeping inside. "I came north looking for land to work," he said. "I found land, and then I found considerably more than land." He turned to look at her, and his face in the last light was exactly the face she had looked at across a hotel desk in September of 1879, and also not remotely that face, because it had acquired in the intervening years the particular quality of a face that has been loved and has loved in return. "Yes," he said simply. "I am content." She put her hand in his. They sat on the porch in the summer evening with the horses moving in the pasture and their children sleeping inside and the tree line going dark against the sky, and the word temporary belonged to another time entirely. So far back it was like something that had happened to different people. In the autumn of 1885, Nora Fitch came back into their lives in a satisfying manner. She had been corresponding with Caroline steadily since leaving the cabin, and her letters had traced a trajectory from difficult beginnings to steady employment too. In the most recent letter before this autumn, the tentative mention of a man named Frank Hollis, who worked at the surveying office in town, and who had been accompanying her to church on Sundays and seemed serious in his intentions. Frank Hollis came to supper in October, a gangly, earnest young man of 26 with a kind face and an obvious appreciation for Nora that he did a poor job of concealing, which Caroline found completely winning. He shook Clarence's hand with the sincerity of a man who understands the significance of the people he is meeting, and he admired the homestead with genuine interest and asked Clarence several knowledgeable questions about the cattle operation. He held Samuel with careful competence and did not flinch when Samuel grabbed his collar and pulled, which Caroline privately considered a significant qualifying event. Nora caught Caroline in the kitchen alone before supper. "Well?" Nora asked. "I like him," Caroline said. "He is terrified of Clarence. Clarence has that effect on people he does not yet know. Does he terrify you?" Caroline thought about the first winter, the caulking, the coffee cup on the left side of the shelf. "Never," she said, "not for one moment." Nora smiled the smile of someone who has also, it turned out, found the thing she did not know she was looking for. "He has asked me to marry him," she said. "And you said?" "I said I would think about it," Nora said with a glint of amusement. "I have thought about it. I am going to say yes." The wedding was the following spring, and Caroline stood beside Nora in the same church where she herself had stood beside Clarence 6 years before, and the spring light came through the windows that had been repaired since then. And Reverend Aldous Cole performed the ceremony with the confidence of a man who has gotten considerably better at this over the years, and it was a good morning. By the spring of 1886, the homestead was entirely settled into its own identity. Tom Easley had become a permanent fixture and had developed an improbable friendship with Margaret, who at 6 years old treated him as a primary source of equestrian knowledge and followed him around the barn asking questions about horses with an intensity he met with patient expertise. Samuel, at 2, was in the dedicated business of exploring every corner of the property at maximum speed and minimum caution, and both his parents had developed the practiced parental attention of people who know that turning your back is a calculated risk. The letter from Caroline's sister in Missouri arrived in April. Her sister, Ada, was the older of the 2 remaining Whitaker siblings. Their mother had died 2 years previous, which Caroline had known and grieved in the particular muffled way of grief that happens at a distance. And Ada's letter said that she was thinking about coming west, if the stories were true, if there was indeed a life to be built out there. She was 41 and widowed, and her grown children were scattered to their own lives, and she had, she said, with a directness that reminded Caroline of her own voice, reached the conclusion that staying in Missouri was simply staying in Missouri, and she was ready for something with more room in it. Caroline read the letter twice and then read it aloud to Clarence. "What do you think?" he asked when she had finished. "I think she should come," Caroline said. "We have room." "We have room," she agreed. Ada Whitaker arrived in July, 60 years after the first wave of westward settlement, and still with all the dignity and practicality of the farming family she had come from. She was stockier than Caroline and louder, and had strong opinions about the best way to do nearly everything, which initially created a certain friction in the kitchen, but resolved itself within 2 weeks into a functional working partnership based on mutual respect, and the recognition that neither of them was going to change, and they might as well be efficient about it. Ada found work quickly in the growing community. She had skills in textile work, and within a season had established a small enterprise making clothing and doing alterations for the families in the valley. She boarded in town at first, and then when a small plot of land came available south of the Keene homestead, she began making inquiries that Clarence helped facilitate. "Your sister intends to stay," he observed to Caroline one evening. "She is a Whitaker," Caroline said. "We make decisions and we commit to them." "I have noticed that," he said. "Is that a complaint?" "It is an observation that has consistently worked in my favor," he said. "So no." Ada built a small house on her plot by the fall, with help from Tom Easley and 2 of Pete Bauer's men and Clarence himself, who had by now enough experience building on this land to do it efficiently. It was not a grand house, but it was solid and practical, which suited Ada entirely. The 2 sisters settled into a proximity that was comfortable and occasionally contentious, and always deeply familiar, the particular relationship of women who have known each other their entire lives, and have the freedom to be entirely honest with each other, because the love underneath it is not in question. Margaret adored her Aunt Ada with a completeness that Ada reciprocated, and Samuel was mystified by her but charmed. And the extended family that Clarence and Caroline had built from scratch in this valley was beginning to look like something durable. In the evenings, after the children were in bed and Tom Easley was at the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, Caroline and Clarence sat together the way they had been sitting together since that first winter, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply in the companionable silence of 2 people who have grown so accustomed to each other's presence that silence has become a form of conversation. On an evening in late autumn, with the first frost of the season making itself known on the window glass, Clarence was reading the territorial newspaper, and Caroline was writing a letter, and he said, without looking up, There is an article here about women's suffrage in the territory. Wyoming granted women the vote in 1869, she said, without looking up from her letter. I know. The article is about the push for statehood and whether the state constitution will preserve it. It had better, she said. I agree with you completely, he said, and went back to reading, and there was in his voice the same uncomplicated alignment that had characterized the way he engaged with the things she believed. Not deference exactly, not performance, but genuine conviction running parallel to hers. She had thought about this sometimes, how different her life might have been if the man she had stumbled into this arrangement with had been a different kind of man. A man who found her competence inconvenient, or her opinions excessive, or her habit of reorganizing things an affront. She had known enough such men to know they were not rare, and she had found this specific, angular, careful, generous man with winter sky eyes who built the fire before she came in from the cold and read novels with feeling, and had named her second child in part after her friend Pete Bauer and who had never, not once, asked her to be smaller. Clarence, she said. He looked up from the paper. I love you, she said, plainly, without preamble, because she had been thinking it and saw no reason it should stay only a thought. He set the paper down. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. I love you, he said, and then, I have loved you for a very long time. I know, she said. I have been watching. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was a hard one across Wyoming and much of the West, the winter that the ranching world later called the Big Die-Up, when temperatures dropped to extremes that killed cattle across the territory in devastating numbers. The Keene operation lost a third of their herd, which was a blow that they felt sharply and managed with the careful seriousness of people who have built something and intend to rebuild it. Clarence was out in the cold for weeks working to save what cattle could be saved, and Caroline managed the ranch and the house and the children and kept meticulous account of what they lost and what they retained and what they would need to recover. They talked through everything, every decision, together at the table late at night after the children were sleeping, with the lamp burning and the figures spread before them. They disagreed on a few things. She thought they should sell the lower pasture to cover immediate costs. He thought they should borrow against it and keep it because the lower pasture was their best ground. And they argued it back and forth across 2 evenings with the honest friction of people who take each other seriously. And in the end, they landed on a modified version of her plan that held the lower pasture but sold a portion of their equipment to cover the winter debt. You were partly right, he said. And you were partly right, she said. We usually end up in the middle. The middle is not always a compromise, she said. Sometimes it is just where the correct answer lives. He considered this. That is a very tidy way to look at it. I am a tidy person, she said. He glanced around the kitchen, which had Samuel's wooden animals arranged along the windowsill and Margaret's drawings pinned along one wall and Ada's jar of dried herbs on the counter, and the general evidence of a full and untidy life. You are many things, he said. The recovery from that winter was slow but steady, and by 1888 the herd was rebuilt and the finances were stable, and Tom Easley had become a quarter partner in the operation, because Clarence had made the straightforward calculation that Tom's continued presence was worth more than the percentage of profit it cost, and said so directly, which made Tom stare at him for a moment and then nod and say, I am not going anywhere, and that had been that. Margaret was 8 by then, and a determined and serious student who was Miss Ward's favorite pupil, though Miss Ward attempted diplomacy by not saying so directly. She came home from school one Friday in the spring with a composition she had written that she wanted to read aloud at supper, which she did, with some ceremony. A description of the homestead as she saw it, the garden and the barn and the horses and her parents and her brother, and at the end of it a line that said, My mother says that when she came here it was going to be temporary, which means for a short time only, but she is still here and my father is still here, and I was born here, and Samuel was born here, and I think that is what temporary looks like when it becomes forever. There was a silence at the table when she finished. Samuel looked from his sister to his parents with the evaluating look of a 6-year-old trying to assess whether the silence was good or bad. Caroline had her hand over her mouth. Clarence cleared his throat. "That is very well written, Margaret." "I know," Margaret said, with the modesty of someone who also knows. Caroline caught Clarence's eye. His expression was the one she had catalogued carefully over the years, the suppressed smile, the winter sky warmth, the quality of a man who is feeling something considerably larger than what he will say. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Forever," she said quietly. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Forever," he agreed. The summer of 1888 was the best summer the valley had in memory, warm and well-watered and generous in the way that some seasons are generous, as if offering compensation for the hard ones. The garden produced abundantly, and Caroline put up more preserves than she had ever managed, and the cattle were fat and healthy, and the market at Cheyenne was good. Pete Bauer came to supper in August and ate 3 helpings of Caroline's beef stew, and declared that he had eaten well at many tables in his 78 years, and none better than this one, which was possibly an exaggeration, but was offered with complete sincerity. Margaret rode Butter now, had been riding her since she was 5, under supervision, and now rode with the confidence of a child who has grown up with horses and takes them entirely for granted in the best possible way. Samuel had begun to show the same inclination, and Clarence was teaching him, with a patience that Caroline watched and appreciated, the way he moved beside the boy and showed him without doing it for him, which she recognized as his fundamental teaching philosophy, and also his fundamental philosophy about most things. In September of that year, Nora Hollies, formerly Fitch, came to visit with her husband Frank and their daughter, a cheerful red-haired child of 2 named Abigail, and the afternoon was spent with children running through the grass and adults on the porch with coffee, and the particular ease of people who have earned their ease. Nora, watching Caroline watch Clarence demonstrate something to Samuel at the fence line, said, "You are looking at him the way you looked at that cabin the first time I saw it." "What way is that?" "Like it is yours," Nora said. "Like you built it and you know every part of it and you are not going anywhere." Caroline considered that. "That is an accurate description," she said. "I thought so." Nora smiled into her coffee. "I told you years ago that he was in love with you." "You did. Was I right?" Caroline watched Clarence lift Samuel up to show him something over the fence, some small event in the pasture, and Samuel grabbed his father's shoulder with both hands and leaned out over the fence with the fearlessness of a child who has never doubted that the arms holding him are reliable. "Yes," she said, "you were entirely right." When the last day of that summer came, the day when the air turned and you could feel the season changing, feel autumn in the quality of the light, and the first edge in the wind, Caroline walked out to the garden to pull the last of the beans. The sunflower stalks were drying at the fence the way they always dried, bent and golden-seeded, rattling softly. The mountains in the west were clearer than they had been all season, the way they get in that particular autumn light, close and enormous and utterly permanent. Clarence came out and stood beside her without saying anything, as he sometimes did. She gave him a handful of beans to carry. He took them. They walked back to the house together across the ground they owned, past the barn where Tom Easley was working, past the fence where Margaret had left her jacket on a post, toward the door of the house where the lamp was already lit in the kitchen window because she had lit it before she came out, and the warm light came through the blue and white check curtains she had made so long ago that the fabric had been replaced twice over and yet was always the same. The door was open. Inside, Samuel was talking loudly to someone or something, probably the cat they had acquired the previous winter when it had simply walked in from the cold and declined to leave, which Caroline considered a reasonable approach to finding a home. Margaret was at the table, reading. The smell of supper was in the air. She went in. He came in behind her and pulled the door to against the evening chill and hung his hat on the peg beside her coat. The way he had hung his hat beside her coat for years now. So many years that the peg had a permanent slight lean from the weight of them. And the cabin, the homestead, the home settled around them both, as it always did, as it had done for 4 winters and then several more after that, as it would do for all the seasons still coming. He had told her it was temporary. She was still here. He was still here. And neither of them had complained, not for one single day of all the days they had been given. And when Caroline thought about that, about the specific miracle of finding the right life in the right place with the right person, she understood that temporary was simply what the beautiful things called themselves before they understood what they were. She set the beans on the kitchen counter and turned around and found him looking at her, the way he always found occasion to look at her, with the complete and uncomplicated attention of a man who considers what he is looking at the most important thing in the room. "Supper in half an hour," she said. "I know," he said. "I can smell it from the barn. Wash up." "I was going to." "You say that and then you forget." He stepped toward her and kissed her briefly, warmly, the easy intimacy of years. And Margaret, without looking up from her book, said, "I can see you," which made Samuel laugh from somewhere under the table where he had apparently been for some time. Caroline laughed and stepped back and swatted Clarence with a dish towel, and he caught it and held it, and she held the other end, and they stood there for a moment, laughing, in the middle of the kitchen of the house they had built from a rough cabin with a patched roof, surrounded by their children and their accumulated life, and the evening light coming through the curtain she had made, and the world was precisely as large as it needed to be and not 1 inch more. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Outside, the first star appeared over the tree line. Inside, the lamp burned. Margaret Reed. Samuel emerged from under the table to announce that the cat had eaten something it should not have. Tom easily knocked at the door and was waved in and accepted coffee and sat at the corner of the table the way he always sat, like a piece of furniture that had always been there. Clarence washed his hands at the basin and dried them on the towel Caroline handed him, their fingers brushing in the passing of it. The beans went into the pot. The biscuits came out of the oven. Margaret was asked to set the table and did so with the efficient competence of a child who has performed a task 10,000 times. Samuel was retrieved from the vicinity of the cat and persuaded to sit. They sat down together, all of them, around the table that Caroline had pushed against the window years ago so they could see the last of the light over the tree line, and there it was, the light, going gold and then amber, and then the soft blue-gray of approaching dark, the mountains holding their last brightness before the evening claimed them. Grace was said by Margaret, who did this with a seriousness that she had apparently decided was her particular responsibility, and which no one had argued with. And then supper in the homestead that had once been a rough cabin that was going to be temporary, where a woman named Caroline Whitaker had come with $14 and a carpetbag and a dead husband's name she had no particular reason to keep, and where a man named Clarence Keene had hung his hat on the peg beside her coat and never moved it, and where 2 children had been born and a life had been built and a school had been raised and a community had been served, and where every winter the fire burned and the snow fell and the world stayed exactly the size it needed to be. Temporary. She was still there. He was still there. Neither complained. And the stars came out over Wyoming one by one, as they always had and would continue to do long after all of them were gone, indifferent and brilliant, and utterly unmoved by the small warm light in the window of the house below them, which burned on through the evening with all the quiet insistence of a thing that has decided to remain.